Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are today, and welcome to today's webinar on understanding ageism in the workplace. We're going to get started in just a few moments, but we still have a few people logging in from the large group that had registered. So we want to make sure we give them some time to get settled in, because we're going to talk about a lot here, and we're going to dive right in after all the introductory stuff. But while we wait, I wanted to just get a sense of where everyone's dialing in from. So you should have in that GoToWebinar panel, you should have a little questions box. Just write that in to the questions box. Let us know where it is that you're coming in from and what your or what time zone you're in generally, right? Well, it's always just good for us to know, get a sense of where people are. So it looks like a few folks are writing in. There's a couple here in the US, right? So it looks like I'm seeing Pennsylvania. I'm seeing Oakville. I haven't heard of Oakville. I've got somebody out in the UK as well. A couple of people as well in Europe, someone in Germany, someone in France. So, okay, pretty good. Okay, someone on the West Coast. So that's a special good morning to you. Okay, somebody else in Providence, just up the road as well. From where I am, up 95, I am down here in New York City. And my colleague who will be joining us in just a moment, or I'll be introducing in just a moment. She's already here, I hope. She is dialing in from the UK. But okay, let's get started with today's webinar. I see a few more have come on. I think we have a slightly fuller house today for this webinar on ageism in the workplace. My name is Jorge Vargas, and I was actually fortunate enough to be in London last week with Mallory Matney, who will be doing some of the talking in just a moment. Mallory, I just realized that your job title, like, I cut off the last letter there when I was moving the text box, and I'm sorry. But anyway, that's Mallory, who lives in London. So good afternoon to Mallory, although we're all confused because the US changed time zones last week, whereas Europe hasn't done daylight savings yet. So it's that 4-hour time shift is very, very confusing. But okay, we are using today the GoToWebinar platform. Just a couple of things to note about this platform. First of all, it does default to computer audio instead of phone, which is perfectly fine. However, if you're having a hard time hearing us, just switch on over to the phone audio. That usually does have slightly better quality. There's just, it could be a problem with Wi-Fi connections, that sort of thing. Okay. Additionally, we will be stopping to ask questions periodically, and we certainly want to hear questions from you. So if you do have any questions, just write that into the questions box right on the GoToWebinar platform. We are recording this session, by the way, so if you miss anything, we'll send out the recording as well. If you want access to Culture Wizard, just write that into the questions window. So let me clarify. We have a brand new course called Ageism in the Workplace regarding power dynamics on age. That is available for purchase. If you are not in a purchasing capacity in your organization, just let us know anyway. We'll still see if we can set you up with trial access to it in some way. But anyway, that course is pretty much what's been leading us on this particular webinar, right? And of course, we borrow some things from it as well. So if you want access to that, just let us know. High level, what is Culture Wizard, right? Who are we? So for over 20 years now, I think almost 25 years now, we've been around providing cross-cultural and global inclusion training for companies really all over the world, working with large enterprises, working with mid-sized companies, small companies. I mean, really very much a very global audience. And we do that using our online learning platform. And at the very end of the webinar, we'll take a look at that. We also provide our instructor-led training options, and we have the Culture Wizard mobile app as well. All right, so all of those are available. And if anyone doesn't have access to Culture Wizard and would like access on a trial basis, just write that into the questions box and we will provide that access for you. Okay, that's it with the introductory stuff. Let's get into the meat of today's agenda. which we think we should be done early. We know it's set for an hour, but we should wrap up on the earlier side, which I think everyone's always grateful for that, so you're welcome. But we'll give that a go. First of all, we're going to start by defining ageism, right? What are we talking about? We're going to talk about some of the nuances of ageism in the workplace. And then lastly, we're going to discuss some strategies to create a more inclusive workplace for all generations. Bearing in mind, right, before we even get into defining it, bearing in mind that right now, because a lot of folks are sort of pushing back retirement, and we have a very large population in the millennials, we have a slightly smaller population of Gen Z, I forgot who followed millennials, Gen Z, right, that are now entering the workforce. We currently have several different generations actively in the workforce, right? We've got Gen Z, we've got millennials, we've got Gen X, and we've got the baby boomers as well, right? Who are still working in many cases, right? So you've got that, and of course you've got I think that the following generation is Gen Alpha, and I think that they're probably entering high school around now, so they're sort of on their way, right? So that's coming. And of course, the baby boomer generation is actually a very large population, right? That's why they're called the baby boomers. And so it's not like, in 4 years' time, oh, it's just going to be 4 generations. No, there's actually going to be all 5 of these different groups sharing workspaces, right? And learning to work together, and with all the differences that come into play from life experience to degrees of having grown up with technology and the different technologies that you grew up with and having assimilated into new technologies. All of that's at play here, right? And really can't be denied, right? There are differences, obviously, in how we were all raised, depending on when we were born and where we were born, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that too, if we have some time. So that's the context for why we're having this discussion. But now let's jump into what are we talking about. Ageism is a form of bias that stereotypes or associates negative behaviors or negative qualities of an individual based on their age. I want to be really clear, right? The key here is this piece about stereotypes, right? And focusing on negative behaviors, negative qualities based on age. And I should also add based on age or perception of age, right? Some people may look younger or older than they really are, or may sound younger or older than they really are. And and eventually you realize what their actual age is, and you'll realize, oh, I've been treating this person differently. That's a bias, right? There's a little bit of bias there. But specifically, it's the negative part of it, right? So there is, and the stereotyping, right? There is something to be said. I made the statement before, right? That different generational groups obviously grew up with different technologies. That's something that you can't change, right? That's just a part of history. Some generations grew up without computers. Some folks grew up when computers were very, very different than they are today. Myself, right? When I was in Peru, I didn't have a computer. I didn't even really know what one was. When I moved to the US, they had computers in schools, but they were still kind of new. They had those big floppy A disks that were actually floppy, right? Like I'm talking about the big ones, right? Those still existed. It was a different kind of technology, right? And as I was growing up, technology sort of changed. I was lucky enough to sort of grow with that technology. People younger than me, they grew up with all this stuff, right? So they kind of take it for granted. My daughter has she knows how to use an iPad, she knows about iPhones, she knows all this different stuff. And so when you speak to her about, oh yeah, it was a lot of effort to take pictures when I was a kid, it doesn't compute, right? Like obviously you explain it and she'll get it, but initially there's a moment of what do you mean? And then you have your phone and it's like, well, no, it didn't exist yet, right? We weren't even close. So yeah, there are some things that are real about the age that you may have, but then there are other things that cross over into stereotyping, right? So for instance, saying that someone who's currently in their 50s did not grow up with the same technology that we have today, right, is unless they're time travelers, is probably a factual statement. Saying that someone who is currently in their 50s can't learn how to use the technology today or is not proficient with it because they are currently in their 50s, that's not a factual statement, right? That is actually, at that point, you are dealing in stereotypes and negative bias, and that's what we're talking about, right? It's that difference, because sometimes I think people get confused and they feel like, oh, well, we can't talk about facts. It's like, no, you can. It's all the other stuff, right, that we really want to talk about and say like, hey, some of it, or actually all of it, really has no place in how you are weighing a person's efficiency or deciding whether or not they're eligible for a job and all these different things, right? And I know I'm focusing a lot on technology, but we actually have a lot of other examples that have nothing to do with technology, and we are going to talk about the intersectionality of age and other things like gender and race, because all of those also come into play, right? But my colleague Mallory will take it from here and kind of walk us through some of those biases as way of example. So Mallory, I yield the floor, and I'm very proud of myself because the last webinar we did, I missed my cue and I read all through her slides, realized halfway through. Today, I was like very on it, don't do that. Mallory, I yield the floor.
Thank you. One thing that Jorge just mentioned that I want to emphasize is that ageism it's more than just talking about just younger generations or just older generations. Ageism is when we speak without thinking and we can perpetuate these stereotypes and bias against people from all different generations without even realizing what we're doing. So that's why we have these examples here, such as he's still living in the 1960s, and this is associating older generations with being stuck in the past or limited in their ability to grow and learn. Saying someone sounds young, their voice sounds young, and therefore they are untrustworthy, or maybe they are inexperienced. The example we have is she sounds like she's about 15 years old. Another one is she's probably going to go on maternity leave as soon as we hire her. And this is an assumption that a woman of childbearing age will leave to have a baby. And even the things that referring to something casually that excludes someone, like you're too young to know this, but you know, that does count as a microaggression, even when it is inadvertent. And then finally, it's time for her to retire. This is pressuring older generations to retire, assuming that someone is redundant because of their age. And I also want to say that exclusion based on age can often come in nonverbal forms as well. So say you enjoy stepping out of the office with colleagues in a similar age demographic to you, maybe similar stages of life. You go get coffee or you get lunch or you get drinks after work. You end up sharing ideas, gossip, potential projects, other information that may be of value to someone who is not in that circle, perhaps someone who is not in your generation. And who's going to remember to share that information with colleagues who are not in your age demographic, in the similar stages in life? So it's important that we are aware of who we're surrounding ourselves with and make sure that we are inclusive in things as simple as sharing information. I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality, because ageism can impact someone at any age. However, we do need to factor in intersectionality. For older adults with other marginalized identities, such as those based on race, ethnicity, ability, neurodiversity, sexual orientation, gender identity, the impact of exclusion can be amplified based on multiple stereotypes and bias. Research says that ageism has been shown to be present across demographics of all of these marginalized identities as both perpetrators and targets of ageism. People with multiple identities can experience increased disrespect, sometimes in the form of subtle or outright impatience. Say someone has some mobility issues and they take longer to get seated into the meeting room. Something as simple as showing impatience for that is a form of both ageism and ability. Cultural differences in respect for elders. There may be an expectation based on culture, what it means for someone to be older than you and what is expected in terms of how that interaction goes, whether or not the levels are of the individuals are equal or not in terms of their job levels. Tokenization is also another one that impacts people within all of these intersectional identities, sorry. A physical appearance too, sometimes the way that someone sees can be an expectation for how they are treated. Say someone quote unquote looks younger, then they may be treated differently than someone who looks the age that they actually are. And there's also a chance of being ignored or discriminated against due to others' discomfort. An example might be someone from the LGBTQ community who is of an older generation. They may feel that they need to hide their sexuality, since it's a stigma against older people of being open about their sexual orientation. And there might just be an entirely different a reticence to talk about personal life based on their generation. Also, intersecting experiences of historically systematic bias, of course. So all of these things kind of play into the ways in which other people can inadvertently have microaggressions, such as questioning someone's intelligence, their ability, even the validity of the kinds of accommodations someone might need based on their physical or neurodivergent needs. So if someone is of a younger generation and they are asking for an accommodation, or maybe this thing, you know, you're speaking a bit too loud. Could you just kind of lower your volume because of my sensitivity to loud noises, and those might be written off. And oh, you're young. You don't. What are you talking about? You don't. What's there? There's no issue here because you don't need that kind of accommodation because of your age. So, in the same ways that we have systematic bias towards some identities as being kind of the standard or a default group, meaning we build rules and processes to fit those standards, we do the same thing with age, and that is why intersectionality is important in this context. I want to talk about ageism, how it comes in different forms across generations. And one of the ways it shows up is at the intersection of gender and age. Some stereotypes directed at women who either belong to younger generations or simply have voices that are perceived as being young, which can impact how someone perceives their job title or level of expertise. Think about if you've ever noticed or made assumptions about someone's age or credibility based on the way that their voice sounds. One association with sounding young is the verbal tendency of upspeak or uptalk, something that's evolved into what's kind of known as the TikTok or influencer voice, where people, mostly generations younger than millennials, use something called vocal fry. So an example of upspeak could be, I can take on this project, versus I can take on this project. So you see how differently my message can be perceived. And with this trend of younger generations, where there are people in the influencer sphere who do speak a certain way that is kind of adopted as the norm for some generations. So I can take on this project. So that's the vocal fry. 57% of leaders report that using upspeak or vocal fry, it actually damages a person's professional credibility. Its original purpose is to convey a sense of deference or playfulness in order to be seen as likable, non-confrontational. And young women are already facing challenges of being taken seriously or being perceived as less experienced, especially in male-dominated fields. While men are often praised for their confidence when they speak up and assert themselves in the workplace, and depending on their age or perceived age, women are seen as being suspicious in their ambition, or bossy or pushy for exhibiting that same behavior. So the problem is that this exposes an internalization of gendered bias towards young women, and this amplifies the stereotype of young women not having the same level of expertise. The biases we have for women, especially young women, are so deeply embedded in our society that we can all get caught up in these harmful stereotypes when it comes to younger generations. So Jorge, maybe you want to talk a little bit about power dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, Mallory. And we'll talk about power dynamics in a moment. I just wanted to go back for one quick minute to highlight again this whole thing, this point that I was making before, right, about the difference between opinion and fact, right, and specifically this one here, right, this you're too young to know this, but presented like that, absolutely right, you're kind of dealing with a biased situation. In other situations, though, you may actually be speaking to someone who's never lived, let's say you're in the finance field, who's never lived through a financial meltdown like the one that we saw in 2009, right? Or the ones that we saw in the 80s. So yes, it might be someone who's fresh out and it's their first job, and you say, hey, you haven't experienced this, right? But here's roughly what we should expect to happen, right? It's going to be a rough few weeks, rough couple of months, whatever, right? So there are ways to say these things, right? Because sometimes it is a valid point you're trying to get across, but you want to kind of think about how am I phrasing it in such a way that it doesn't come off like a microaggression. But now let's talk about, whoa, way too fast. Now let's talk about power. And how it relates to all of this, because it's at the heart of the upspeak example, right? For instance, while Mallory was speaking, I was kind of thinking about the fact that when, first of all, as far as I understand it, men typically don't use upspeak, right? There's something in our voices, right? They're typically deeper and so forth. So you don't. It's more difficult to do upspeak, and more importantly, there is something in how a man's voice is perceived, right, which is a bias in and of itself, that they're more authoritative, right? So it's rare for a man to lean into something that comes off as disarming or non-threatening, right? We don't, as men, we usually don't have that concern, right? When we're giving an opinion, we just sort of give our opinion. Right. So even that example, it is one that does kind of speak to how gender has a lot to do with this. It doesn't mean that young men don't face their own challenges and biases against them, and have their own biases as well that they're bringing into the workplace, right? But this kind of voice one isn't necessarily one of them. Now, why am I talking about gender, right? Why am I talking about all this? Because power dynamics are essentially a conversation around who wields authority in the workplace. And I always talk about, when I talk about power, when I talk about authority, I always point out to people that there are two kinds of power, two kinds of authority. There's official power structures, right? So in official power structures, you've got your board, you've got your CEO, you've got the rest of the C-suite, you've got your VPs, you've got your senior VPs, you've got all kinds of VPs, you've got your senior leaders, your managers, your associates, and so forth, all the way down, right? That's official power structures. It's what HR has. We call it an org chart. Unofficially, there are different types of authority at play, and they exist in every single workplace, and sometimes they exist for very good and legitimate reasons, right? Just because unofficial power exists doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I'll give you an example. So let's say that you are a member of an engineering team, right? Software developers, and you know that there's a guy on the team or a gal, whatever, there's a person on the team who happens to be a particular whiz at this particular type of code that's being programmed. Sorry, my phone's going nuts. This particular type of code that's being written, right? And he understands how to debug and all this stuff. Officially, when you run into a problem, you should go to your manager. But you know, and the manager knows, and this engineering software whiz knows that the manager is just going to go to this person. So unofficially, there's an unspoken rule that when you run into a problem here, you just go to that person, right? And say, hey, I'm stuck here. Can you help me out? Official power exists because you don't want to burden that person, and you want to make sure that their manager understands their workload and all this stuff. In the real world, however, we've all seen that happen, right? That's a power dynamic there, right? Where this person has because of their skill with something, they have a little bit of power. Now, that's not much, right? Being asked for help with something isn't that much power, but there are many, many other situations where maybe you're thinking of that VP who just for some reason always managed to get his way or her way. And that was the person that you went to when you needed to push forward something on your agenda. It's the same concept, right? But it's a much different level of power. And in the example that I just gave about the VP, it may not necessarily be because that person is particularly good at their job. It could be because he happens to be the oldest VP or the only male VP, or he happens to be a brother-in-law with the CEO, whatever, right? Whatever the reason is, it might be something that has to do with merit and something that, you know, this person just, for whatever reason, is the one that gets things done, or it might be for other things, right? That have to do with all those things that were on Mallory's Venn diagram a couple of slides ago. So age plays into this in a huge way, except age, like many other types of biases, is very much a double-edged sword. To give you an example, typically age, the older you are, the more power you typically will have in the workplace. That's a pretty airtight rule of thumb. Even and I speak from experience here, right? I was in tech startups in the 2010s when everybody wanted to be the youngest tech developer and be hip and all this stuff. And the younger you were, the better you were because you knew all the latest technology, right? That was very much the ethos and the mindset. And anyone, if anyone wants to confirm that in the comments, I'm happy to read your experiences. But that was very much what was going on between, I would say, 20, or honestly, even 2008, all the way through to about 2018, 2019. What happened around 2018, 2019? Was there a big economic collapse for the tech industry? Not really. Did they realize maybe they were overhiring? Maybe. What really happened was a lot of those engineers who had built up a whole mysticism around being young, they got old. So suddenly the narrative changed and it was like, okay, yeah, you might have the newer technologies, we've got more experience, right? And so that narrative started to change. Throughout, in every single industry and workplace, you will typically see that the older you get, the more power you have, right? And that's for a lot of reasons. Some of them have to do with biases. Some of them just have to do with the fact that you've been around longer and you just happen to know more stuff. And you happen to know more people, you know more secret handshakes, you know how things work better. And that's, you know, some of that's okay, some of that's not so okay. Now, the challenge, of course, with age is when you get to a certain age, you start to lose some of that influence and power, right? Because suddenly we get to the questions that were on the screen that Mallory was sharing before about, hey, when is this person going to retire, right? Are they losing it? Can they really keep up now, right? And that's pretty much what starts to come up. And again, across every industry, in every workplace, right? So that's one example of how power sometimes can really be on your side, and just as quickly can leave, right? And you're sort of back, you start to sort of lose power in those situations, right? Because people suddenly, they'll start questioning you and wondering, hey, what's going on? Now, let's give another example. And this is one that I think many of you on this call have probably faced or will face in some future, right? And that is when you're a younger manager, right? You're fresh into management, you've got your first team, etc., and you've got people who are older than you. And I'm not talking, you know, they're 2 or 3 years older. I'm talking significant life stages older than you, right? You might be 30 and you're managing someone who's 48 and is about to put a kid through college. That's a very different life stage than what you're in, right? And that's a challenge too, because there, when that happens, you do kind of walk into a situation where you will have official power on one side, right? You are the manager, but you have this unofficial power structure on the other side, right? This person's been around longer, has more experience, all of these things, and can say to you, you know, hey kid, that's great, but I've got this. I know what to do. Thank you. Been doing this for 20, 30 years. I know what to do. It's a hard thing to come back from, right? It's a very hard thing to come back from. And in those situations, right, as a manager, someone who's lived it, right, it's always good to enter those situations with a very open mindset, first of all, right? Understand that, yeah, the person does have a point. They absolutely have a ton of experience that you may not have. Use that, right? And say, okay, well then show me, okay, like this is what I want to do. Let's talk about it, and walk me through. But here's the thing. Don't just do it with the person who's got a ton of experience. Do it with everybody else on your team. Right? That's how you don't play favorites, because if you're only doing it with the people who've been around longer, all you're basically doing is feeding into this sort of ageism bias, right? Except you're kind of, in a bizarre way, you're sort of doing it against yourself. Instead, work with everybody on your team and ask them all for input, right? Give them all that equal opportunity. You may find that some of them don't really have much input to give because they may not have the experience, they may not have the interest, whatever, and that's fine, right? At that point, that's okay. You go on with the people who do interact. So always kind of have that in mind in those situations, right? But always remember that when you do come up against age, it's something that every single one of us will confront. Right? Time is the ultimate power broker across humanity. Always has been, always will be. We will all be young, and we will all age, right, in some form or another. So you have to look for that as kind of the starting off point, and always just remember that and go into every conversation with just that sort of reminder in the back of your mind of, hey, this person might be young and maybe doesn't get it, whatever, but be patient, right? And teach this person because you were there once too, and someone taught you, hopefully, right? And if they didn't, change the cycle, right? And be the person who teaches the younger one. Or it may be the reverse, and you may say, oh my God, I can't, this person, I don't know, they're too set in their ways, I have no patience for this. Be patient. One day someone's gonna be saying the same exact thing about you, and they may be right, and they may be, or they may be wrong, right? But either way, don't fall into the same trap, right? And really try to find out, what's this person all about? Are there maybe reasons that this person has for ignoring what you're trying to do, or for being, quote unquote, set in their ways, and learn from them. And yes, you may find that actually they shouldn't be set in their ways and they should be changing, and that's a conversation that also needs to happen, right? But that again is where you have to learn and grow as an individual, and be open-minded to what the person in front of you is saying. So that's just some things to think about. Now, what I've been describing is not on the screen, but what I've been describing is essentially what we call the pause reflect model, which essentially states that individuals should always, when they're faced with a situation where they might be biased about something, they should stop and ask themselves, why am I making the value judgment that I am making? Right? Why am I deciding that this person or this situation needs to be interpreted in this particular way? We call that the pause reflect model. Those of you who have access to the Cultural Wizard platform, specifically to our inclusion suite, you will find that model available to you in our, oh boy, I tried to do this one off the cuff and I probably should write it down. You'll find it in 2 of our courses, the Inclusive Leadership course, as well as the course on overcoming implicit bias, right? So you'll find it in both of those courses straight away if you are looking for that resource. Now, having said that, let me go through the rest of these sections here, or rest of these recommendations here, right? So first of all, and this is more for, I'm switching gears a little bit. This is more for DEI practitioners, but not exclusively, right? It's if you wield this kind of influence, and it's for you too. But when you're writing your policies, whether it's for the whole company or for your team, think about your people. Who do I have working for me? Who do I have on this team? Is this a policy that makes sense for them? Right? Don't just go online and say, or go into ChatGPT and say, oh, ChatGPT says this should be a policy. That never works, right? There's a reason why we have brains and the machines don't. Focus your discussion on intersectionality, right? Everything that Mallory was talking about and some of the examples that I gave, that all have to do with intersectionality. It's all about finding common points and working through them together so that you can have these kinds of conversations. And so when you do encounter resistance, you have other avenues to start a conversation. Learn about curiosity conversations, right, what they're all about, how to have one. In other words, curiosity conversation sounds like a big fancy term. It's basically how to ask questions respectfully, right? Learn how to do that. And how do you do that? Well, the example that I kind of pointed to before, just let me go quickly to this. It's not in the form of a question, right? But this piece here about you're too young to know this bot. There's a much more respectful way to say that if you are truly trying to get a point across about the person's not having experienced a particular life event or something that might be important to the conversation. There are ways to do that respectfully, right? That's essentially what we're talking about here. See if you can create opportunities for intergenerational coaching as needed and where appropriate. And that could mean, having someone who has more experience helping out someone who's newer in the workforce. It could mean someone who's newer in the workforce and just has more experience with new technologies, coaching in the reverse, right? For people who are older than them, who've been around longer, right? It does cut both ways. I think people hear coaching, they immediately assume, oh yeah, it's the older person is coaching the younger person. In some cases, yes, but not always, not exclusively. Create opportunities for cross-generational groups to interact socially, right? So in other words, if you are planning a social outing, have it be something that makes sense for, again, people first, for your people, right? Think about who's on the team, what are things that they would all roughly enjoy, right? And then let's do that, right? And that might mean that, hey, the ultra CrossFit 5K thing that we're planning might not be the best thing, right? If you have some people who might have a hard time running and doing all these things, that might not be the best option for you, right? Maybe find some other team activity to do. Also, if that's a team activity you're doing, that's pretty hardcore. Okay, and then lastly, provide clear responses to microaggressions. If someone does commit a microaggression, know what to do in those situations, know how to intervene, how to call it out, know how to identify if it's a repeated activity, right? Because then you might have a different sort of challenge there. I have been in situations where I've seen employees kind of talk down to their colleagues because of their age, right? And I've seen it in both situations where someone will act like, oh, the older person doesn't know what they're talking about, and I've certainly seen where some older employees will talk down about their younger colleagues, sometimes even in client-facing roles. When you see that, have a clear response, right? And have a clear reaction to that. I'm getting a question here, by the way, about coming in. So I'm working with, I'm going to just read it out loud. I'm working with older adults trying to get back into the workforce, and they feel their experience is almost had employees look them over due to age. How can we help address this? Ooh, that's a tough one. So there's no silver bullet to this particular question, except, especially not for the person applying for the job. I mean, you can use AI and all these things. You can speak more to some of your technological, your tech savviness and that sort of thing on the resume, and that could help. Because usually that's where the bias is coming from. In your cover letter and so forth, you can address long-term ambitions and things like that, because there could also be a bias of, this person is going to come here and retire in a couple of years, right? And by the way, talking about intersectionality, young women have that same bias, except it's not about retirement. It's this woman's going to come, especially if they're recently married, this woman's going to come here and get pregnant in a couple of years. It's the same thing, by the way, right? It's that same part of, for the hiring manager, it's that same thing of, I don't want to hire them because they're going to leave soon. So again, intersectionality, right? What, instead of focusing it as, what advice would you give to older people, think of it as, what advice would you give to women in that scenario, right? You may find different answers. Same thing if we're talking about technology and not having that sort of, or thinking that maybe because you're older, people will overlook you and say, oh, this person doesn't understand technology well enough. Think about someone changing careers. What advice would you give to that person, even if it's a younger person changing careers, right? How can you shift that narrative a little bit so you can provide better answers? That's for all, that's, by the way, for the candidate side. For the hiring managers, right, for the companies themselves, invest in serious training for your hiring managers. Your hiring managers are very, very important, and they tend to be very, very overlooked in terms of these kinds of trainings, but their biases are outsized in terms of the impact that they will have within the organization. So if they have specific biases, they're the population you really need to focus on. And I'm not talking about setting hiring quotas and all this stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about having them understand what bias is, having them recognize when they have biases, and then being able to kind of talk through that a little bit and give them different mechanisms to overcome those, because you will see biases not just against people who are older. You will see biases against pretty much every single different category of person, depending on who your hiring managers are, what their kind of core behaviors are, right? So really focus on them. So great question. Again, I don't have any silver bullets, but I hope that helped. Okay, so on that note, I am going to now go on over to the Culture Wizard platform and show you just a couple of resources that we talked about today. I'm just going to pull that up. And of course, if you are interested in any of this material, feel free to write into us. My email is jorge.vargas@rw-3.com, or you can always just write into the questions box, and we'll be more than happy to help. So I talked very, very briefly about the Overcoming Implicit Bias course. We also talked about the Inclusive Leadership course, right? That's where you're going to find all that material on the Pause Reflect model, which is essentially what I was talking about when I went on my whole big spiel there. Of course, a lot of the content that we went through today comes directly from a very new course that was just released at the end of last year. We've been marketing a brand new redesign of the platform recently, so that's why if you're a client of Culture Wizard, you might not have heard too much about this course, but you will soon. Ageism course essentially kind of looks at the role of intersectionality, looks at what ageism is all about, and talks through different examples of ageism in the workplace. So I do recommend, if you're a client of Culture Wizard, or you're considering Culture Wizard and you haven't seen this yet, just ask, whether it's the salesperson you're speaking to or the client service manager you're speaking to, ask them to show you this course if you're interested. And if you are neither a buyer nor anything like that, you have access to it through your employer, just reach out through that questions box, and I'll be happy to assist you directly with access. And I see a couple of you have. So anyway, I wanted to just show you those couple of resources. We are doing another webinar next week in the US at this time. And I don't remember when Europe changes over, but if we do change over, then I guess an hour later. But next week at this time, we're doing another webinar on neurodiversity. We'll be posting about it on our LinkedIn today. So feel free to just look us up on our LinkedIn page for RW3 Culture Wizard, and we'll be happy to see you next week when we discuss neurodiversity in the workplace and some best practices there. Wanted to thank all of you again. I do see some folks asking for access to the platform. I'm not seeing any new questions, so thank you all. Mallory, thank you so much as well today, and I guess we'll see you all in a week, hopefully.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.